My capacity as chair of the City Council's Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation for our public hearing on docket 0139, message and order authorizing the City of Boston to accept and expend 2 grants from the Massachusetts Gaming Commission for a cumulative amount of $250,000. The purpose of the grants is to fund a portion of the city's cost for the design of the Rutherford Avenue Sullivan Square Project. Matter sponsored by Mayor Walsh and referred to committee January 24th. Just want to remind everyone here that this meeting is being taped and live streamed and will be broadcast live on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and also available later on the City Council's YouTube channel. So thank you to my colleagues for joining. I'm here to my left, City Councilor Ed Flynn, also City Councilor Lydia Edwards, and City Councilor at Large Anissa Sabi-George. And with us, we are proud to have our Transportation Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, excuse me, Jim Galooly. So, do any of my colleagues have an opening statement on this project before we start? No? Do you want to say anything? Good. Okay, Jim, please go ahead.
Good morning, councilors. Thank you very much for hosting us for this action on an accept and expend order. This is pertaining to $250,000 that have been awarded to the City of Boston by the Gaming Commission, Commonwealth of Massachusetts Gaming Commission, and those monies are under a pair of programs they have. One was a planning grant, and the other is in the category of monies that they set aside for surrounding communities, and we needed to declare how we would use those monies as well. We were successful in making an application, sat down with the Gaming Commission, and were interviewed about it. And they found it very compelling that our application was for funds to help complete the design process of a project known as Rutherford Avenue Sullivan Square. The Rutherford Avenue Sullivan Square project goes back a number of years. It's been a project that has crossed over from the last administration to this administration, and has gone through a re-examination upon the conclusion of a lengthy process, which ultimately determined that there would be a casino built across the river. Because of that, we paused the uncertainty of whether there would be a casino across the river. We paused the design that had been underway under the last administration, and we looked at the collective impact of all of the new development that's taking place at a rampant pace through the Everett, Somerville, and Charlestown neighborhoods, which all encircle Sullivan Square, and determined that we needed to revamp the design, and that design now is heading towards a 25% design threshold, where we will make a submittal to the state and the federal government, because that project has a substantial amount of funds from the federal and state governments. We have this money lined up, $152 million, through, excuse me, through the organization known as the Boston MPO. The Boston MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, is an entity where the communities in and around Boston get to compete for federal dollars that are matched by state dollars, and they come up to us from Washington, and there's an annual process, and we were very successful a few years back in getting this project funded through that effort, as I said, to the tune of $152 million. Another process that's taking place related to this project is referred to as the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group. In the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group sounds like quite an exotic title, I'll admit that, but it basically was a means of labeling it something different than people concerned about the impacts of development around Sullivan Square, so it wouldn't get confused with the project that the city is building, the Rutherford Sullivan Square project. So through this Lower Mystic Regional Working Group, we've come to the conclusion with a number of partners, which include Mass DOT, the Gaming Commission, Everett, Somerville, and MAPC, that the future would include a project like the one that the city is now designing, which includes underpasses at both at Sullivan Square and also at Austin Street. These underpasses are going to be dramatically different, though. It should be pointed out, dramatically different than what's out there today. A lot of people think in terms of, oh, it's going to still have an underpass. I'll just give you an example. At Austin Street, there are 6 lanes of traffic in that underpass there, 3 lanes in each direction. In the future, under our plan, there'll be 2 lanes in one direction, 1 lane in the other direction. At Sullivan Square, the underpass that's out there today was built to handle a different type of traffic than we envisioned for the future of Rutherford. That underpass currently is doing its job with 1 lane in each direction, having been removed from the 2 lanes in each direction that was originally there. Our plan would have 1 lane in each direction. We see the underpass being very meaningful, not only in helping us accommodate the growing regional traffic, people coming through that area to get to all these new developments. But we also see it as very positive. If you look at the analogy I'm about to draw, I hope you'll agree that if the traffic that goes under City Square in Charlestown were to be brought up to the surface, I think the people would say, how's that help the environment of people who are trying to enjoy life in City Square, sit at a cafe, enjoy the park. And some people are arguing that having an underpass makes it worse for the environment that we're going to create in Sullivan Square. We're very convinced that it does everything in the opposite. It creates less impact on pedestrians and bicyclists that are using the Sullivan Square area to not have to deal with the through traffic that's going to, because of the nature of the geography over there, by the nature of it, it's going to be compelled to be up at surface streets and mixing in. We've got lots of buses and trucks that can be totally out of sight, out of mind for the people using Sullivan Square by virtue of having this opportunity for that regional traffic not to have to come up to the surface streets. So at any rate, a long way around to tell you that the request we have is for the approval of an accept and expend order, which allows us to take that grant totaling $250,000 from the Gaming Commission to avoid the city having to put those same dollars into the cost of the design that's now ongoing. We'll be able to help offset the 20% share that the city has to match on the design costs. And we're very fortunate that we've also secured federal dollars for the current phase of the design, and we're expecting to, and that would cover 80% of the money, where the city's 20% can be, in a sense, reduced by every dollar that we get from the Gaming Commission to help support this design effort. That'll be a credit to the city's account in terms of our share of 20%. So with that, I'm open to questions and would be happy to answer anything you have you'd like to talk about.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. And we're also joined by Vice Chair of the Committee, Councilor Frank Baker. So I have a bunch of questions. I'm just going to ask a few and then hand it over to colleagues, and I'll clean up at the end. So just on funding overall. So you mentioned that we're aiming for 25% design, you said by sometime this summer?
This June.
By this June, okay. And the total cost of that will be how much? The
project's estimated to cost $152 million, and we have that amount of money that we've secured through the MPO, Boston MPO. And that money starts to become available in the year 2020. It's going to be, the funding is set up to take place over a 5-year period, and the first several years are in the current TIP, which puts us in a very good position.
So $152 million is the cost of construction?
Yes.
Okay, and that's all federal money?
That's 80% federal
Oh, I see.
and 20% state. The federal government requires a 20% match from either state or local government.
Okay, and that's all basically locked in, and is there anything that would threaten that?
Yes, in action on the plan. There are a number of communities out there that would love to have an opportunity to secure the funds that we now have for other projects that would compete with that for funding. And if we don't stay dutifully marching ahead with that design, we run a very clear risk of having the money go somewhere else.
Okay, and so what are the types of thresholds that they check to make sure we're hitting the right, that we're still acting on
the fact
plan?
that we keep to the schedule and get 25% design in by June
I see,
is like a very important factor in this.
And how much is the cost of the 25% design?
That's about $4 million.
Okay, and that's already all been, that's including this 250,000, and the rest is through city funds?
Okay, yeah, so 80% is federal. It's a little bit shy of $4 million, right? That's the current contract. But 80% of it would be from federal dollars, and 20% would be a combination of what the city needs to chip in, as well as any of these types of grants that we're able to secure.
Okay,
So if you do the quick math on the first phase, using for ease of math, the $4 million, $800,000 is the city's share. To this, if we can absorb into this gaming grant, the $250,000, that reduces the city's obligation,
got it.
preserves cash for the city.
And is the rest, the 550, then, is that going to come from the capital budget, or?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Okay, for this next fiscal year? Or is it already?
Yes, I mean, the current fiscal year.
Okay.
We're burning through a lot of money now as we've gotten into past the concept, and we're now doing a lot of engineering work that's needed to locate where the roadway dimensions are, looking at all of the utilities. People who don't do this every day would be amazed to know how much, when you start to move a roadway around, how much money goes into getting utilities out of the place that they are. We want to make sure that we have nice open space and development parcels at the end of this. And so in order to have a parcel of land be useful for development, you can't have a major gas pipe going under it. We've had conversations recently with Eversource, and as they're planning their next steps to enhance the system, we sit with them and have conversations where we say you can't put the pipe there because there's a future development parcel there, even though it looks like a roadway to you today. The new plan is changing now the plan's going to take that big oval. This is, I probably should say a point or two about that. There's a huge oval of traffic that goes around Rutherford in Sullivan Square. And that makes it for a really daring person to cross through there on a regular basis. And what we'll have is a very organized system of traffic signals at corners for a pedestrian walking from Main Street over to the Sullivan Square T station. They're going to have a very safe set of pedestrian crossings. We're managing the way we're doing this remainder surface traffic to keep it from needing to turn heavily at places where pedestrians are crossing. And we're going to have a thorough improvement to the bicycle network as part of this project.
Great. Okay, so, and then in terms of getting to 50% design, 75% design, how does the funding work for that?
Yeah, so we expect to continue to get at least some more of the monies from the federal government. So to the extent that we're able to, as we're negotiating the subsequent contracts, we do two contracts. We do a contract with the engineering firm, our consultant, but we have a simultaneous agreement that we negotiate with Mass DOT. Mass DOT, being the conduit for federal dollars, will be looking for them to, again, give us a 80% federal share. Nothing is certain as we go forward, so every dollar counts.
And do you expect it'll be about 4 million for each new phase of that design? Or?
Total design on this, there's going to be a heavy amount of engineering involved. The total the total design cost is going to be close to 15 million.
Okay.
15.
Okay, great. And who's the engineering firm?
Tetra Tech.
Okay. All right, so final funding-related question before I pass it on.
Sure.
All the buzz about WIN and what's happening with the investigation at the Gaming Commission, how does that impact the grants?
Well, we'll be watching that situation carefully, as will everybody else. And I think that the good news here is that we had this project on the books. It wasn't a project that was awarded because WIN showed up. The difference is that because WIN showed up and because all of these other developers, like at the Hood properties and throughout Charlestown, there's lots of development in the mill now, and that across the river, up in Somerville and over in Everett, there's other developments taking place. That's what caused us to revamp our design, but it's not what got us the money.
Is the 250,000 from WIN to the Gaming
It's
Commission?
there's a pool of funds that come in from the different casino operators who are licensed, and then at that point, the pool of funds, my understanding is now a pool from 3 different entities, and they're using that pool of money to award grants.
Okay, great. Thank you. Councilor Flynn?
Thank you, Councilor Wu, and thank you, sir, for being here. Just wanted to follow up with 2 brief questions.
Sure.
You mentioned 80% of the funding is federal. What federal agency is that from?
Oh, Federal Highway?
Federal Highway.
Councilor?
And I know you mentioned you're working closely with Mass DOT, but how is the interaction or the dialogue between your department and Federal Highway? It's a positive working relationship, or do you mostly let DOT do the interaction?
Yeah, good question. We have, to the extent we have direct dealings with the federal government, it's been very positive. We typically, though, are dealing with Mass DOT, who in a sense acts as Federal Highway's agent on the matters of how the federal money gets spent.
Thank you. And my final question, you talked about pedestrian safety, safe access. Can you also talk about, how it impacts those in the disability community? Will it also be safe access for the disabled and for the elderly needing a little more time to navigate the sidewalks and streets and in the area generally, but safe access for everyone is important to me, but especially those in the disability community?
Yes, absolutely. The world you see out there today, if you were to go through Sullivan Square on foot, poorly lit, fast-moving traffic that is governed by things like yield signs, but doesn't always work. You're going to go into the future where you're going to have a grid of streets, a regular grid of streets. At every corner, there will be traffic controlled by traffic lights. Mm-hmm. Today, we've got one traffic signal around that whole ring, and it's just not a safe situation. For ADA aspects, this will be thoroughly vetted both internally by city experts and also by our own consultant, as well as there'll be reviews consistently through the design by the ADA folks at Mass DOT. The MBTA will be looking at this as well, and they have some real strong advocacy commitment over at the T, because a lot of this is about connectivity for pedestrians and bicyclists from the traditional community side in Charlestown over to those stations. We've got 2 wonderful T stations that are very difficult to get to on foot. There's also major improvements for anybody running, walking, or in a wheelchair going along the whole corridor. We're going to have a linear park as such, where there'll be a separate pedestrian path from a bicycle 2-way path on the community side, and we'll also have sidewalk and a bicycle accommodation heading southbound on the, call it the industrial side, that's going through a lot of renovation. So yes, I think this will be first rate in terms of access. Again, one of the things that we have concluded is that taking a lot of buses that are going from, say, for instance, the MBTA's maintenance garage, having them be able to exit the garage property and go right down into our underpass means they never have to drive through Sullivan Square if they're not going to the station in Sullivan Square. I'm talking about buses that are brought in from other routes that go over to the maintenance garage in Charlestown. And if we tried to do this whole thing as a surface streets, we'd be bringing all that kind of traffic right through, which is no good for anybody on foot, whether they're dealing with a handicapped issue or not. So we're trying to make the environment as positive in Sullivan Square and along the length of the whole corridor for people of all abilities.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Edwards?
Thank you, Councillor Wu. I just had a couple questions about kind of the history and the design process. Excuse me. So you had mentioned before that a lot of what could stop the funding that we're going to get is if we don't march ahead. I'm curious about how the funding came about, correct me if I'm wrong, the funding has been there for some time. So for me, the question is, what's the rush? If it's funding related or not?
Sure.
I'm particularly curious about that.
Sure. So here's how it works over at the MPO. Every year, people get in line and try to line up the funds for their projects. And we're going to be entering that period soon where ironically, between now and the end of June, we'll be doing over the tip. Every year, a lot of projects get pushed back. And they go year after year with delay because they're not hitting those milestones. So you can be in the third year or the fourth year or the fifth year of a TIP, Transportation Improvement Program, which is with a table of and never ever get to use it. That's happened for projects. If you're making your deadlines when the negotiation comes up at the table and people are trying to say, hey, is that project going to be ready? You got to be able to say, yes, it will be ready. Or otherwise, it sometimes can become an illusion because the money doesn't come to the project, and use it whenever you want to. The money is doled out of a budget that's available each year. And so each year, if, for instance, this year, there are any cost overruns on the group of projects, the portfolio of projects that are funded by the MPO, there's a chance that other projects will pay the price and wind up being pushed back. What we don't want to have is this project get pushed back anymore. We've been trying to get it done for 20 years. Mm-hmm. In the
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So it's been a 20-year attempt to try and get this project done. And in that 20 years, there was a surface option or some version of it that was going to be the plan. And my understanding from your comments is that was it the casino that caused the city to change their mind about it?
No, it was a combination of things. What happened was it was because of the casino in the period of time where there was a lot of ambiguity as to whether the casino would actually happen, and if it did, where would it happen? So during that period of time, this project was put on hold. During that hold period, a lot of things started to change in the environment. One after another project started to emerge from the back rooms into announced projects. We come up with a list like this of projects that are being developed in the area, and the implications of all those projects in an environment where we're trying to balance all of the nice things that we want to do for the community, because we want this to be a project that the community is very happy with. But we also know that to make it a success, we can't ignore the regional demands for traffic at this point. We all dream of that day when everybody's taking a bus and nobody's driving in their own personal cars, but we haven't got there, and we don't expect the rate of attaining that is coming fast enough to have us say, let's keep our fingers crossed and build less than the capacity that we are convinced that this project needs. So this is about economic development and complete streets and public transit access, things like ADA. It's about all those things, and I'll just tell you that one of the latest enhancements we've made to our current working design is to add some dedicated surface lanes for buses. And what's ironic is, as we do that, people will say, well, you're making the street too wide, but we're saying it's really critically important to balance these things, because you can see everything we try to do has some implications for somebody. And
that's true. And to your compliment, I was at the last BTD presentation on Sullivan Square, specifically in the design, and I liked what I saw in terms of the community being able to directly comment on the plans.
Yes.
I thought that was a really good process on that component.
Sure.
And I want to give credit where credit is due. I do want to just make sure that I'm again understanding the process and how we got here.
Yeah.
There has been, of course, you're fully aware of the surface option, flexible option, whatever option out there that is the not tunnel option.
Mm-hmm.
And in comparison, it is significantly cheaper than a tunnel. Am I correct?
I couldn't answer that. I imagine it's probably some level less expensive, but
tell me about the analysis between the two different plans and thoughts. I understand why you just explained to me, due to the economic boom and development, there was a need to maybe reassess the plan that was there.
Right.
But when you looked at a specific analysis of the surface option, the speed, the ability for cars to go through, who was that expert's plan that you were looking at, and what did that analysis look?
Sure. The analysis first is, we want to find the right project to build. And if we had two options of that right project, then some of this comparative cost analysis makes sense.
Okay.
But we dismissed the surface design as not tenable based on traffic needs and all of the other components. So it's not like we fully designed.
So there was no comparison analysis?
Everything would have been back of the envelope at the stage of development where we were with the design. So it's kind of like draw a couple of sketches of a couple of automobiles you'd like to choose between, and you haven't really got a designed, engineered car. We're in the process now of taking the version that we're convinced is the right one to build, and we're going to continue to make sure that we do everything we can to keep it on schedule and keep the funding in place.
And I do, again, another thing I'd like to give you guys credit for is, and I heard people say this publicly about the buffer zones, that you increase that space, though not maybe as far as some folks would like, but I will give credit where credit is due. But I think in terms of process, it's a little bit, I can understand why some folks might be frustrated by the dismissal of a plan and then saying that you've made the best decision to go forward with another plan if there has not been in-depth analysis. Is it that you've not seen, there's been no plan directly given to you to look at, or in terms of the surface option? I mean,
no. When I talk about the analysis, we truly did a side-by-side analysis of the two options in terms of feasibility. Will they do the job? And we came to the conclusion that one would and one would not.
Okay.
And we would be needlessly bringing on stress to the system to try to, and we've had people ask us a number of times from the community to do a full cost analysis of the two, and it's like, we're not going to spend a lot of time and engineering dollars costing out something that we know doesn't work.
And when you found out it didn't work and those results of that analysis, that's out publicly, right? Showing
Back
what
in
the
June
analysis.
of last year, we made a formal announcement, and some people have had a difficult time accepting that announcement, but we were very clear, and it's been in the newspapers, and that
the announcement, but I mean the data that you assessed and looked at, all of that is out publicly.
We presented the comparative analysis. It's on our presentations that are posted on the website. Whether it's I don't think it's everything that somebody has in a folder, But it's everything from the conclusions of the side-by-side analysis.
And I know this is my final question, and I
Sure.
really do appreciate the back and forth. Of the two options, one, it seems like there might be, if, for example, we didn't like the tunnel, we're stuck with it. Am I correct? If when you redo the tunnel, we're stuck with it. There's no other option beyond the tunnel. Am I correct? I mean, it's one and done. There's no.
Well, I think either approach that you would build to, you'd be basically get in line for another 25 years to kind of revamp that in any substantial way, because I could say the opposite.
Let me say my question again.
Sure.
When I think of the surface option, I think it's, from my understanding, it's the malleable option. It's one that allows, if it's not working, to expand, to contract, to move to a tunnel, to do all these different things, but you have more options with it. With the tunnel, it's it. The money spent, the time, the effort, it's it. If it does what it's going to do, if it doesn't, that's all we have. And it seems like you have an option that's more malleable than the other. Am I correct in my analysis?
Once we build either option, there's a desire on the part of the community to have parcels that start to get used, and you create a place in Sullivan Square. You can't just then start redesigning the streets again or adding an underpass, because if you're ever going to wind up with an underpass, you want to have it wind up as part of this first go at it, because we don't often get the opportunity to spend $152 million of federal and state dollars to do a whole renovation to an area. As I mentioned, you need to get utilities out of the way for both development parcels, and if you came in later and said, you know what, we should have put in that underpass, that's not a very malleable position you're going to be in. You're going to have a lot of people building buildings on parcels and not wanting to have their life disrupted or their development rights disrupted, and suddenly you've boxed yourselves in a different way.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Oh, Councilor Presley stepped out. Okay, so I'm going to dig in on my list, and then when Councilor Presley returns, we'll hand it over to her. So I just want to push a little further on the design questions, because, you know, we're still relatively early in the process, aiming for the 25%, so there's still time to have these conversations. I think things really get locked in the further and further the city gets into it. So just in terms of the underpass, and you've been talking a lot about surface option not being able to handle traffic of a certain flow from regional traffic, let's say, from all the developments and from the casino. If we zoom in only on local traffic, so residents experience, people needing to drive into Charlestown or onto, you know, the Boston side of that, does the underpass actually preference the cut-through drivers at the expense of local drivers who will then be in that traffic?
I would say just the opposite. The ability to have through traffic under the Sullivan Square, while somebody who's running down to run an errand, see a doctor, drop somebody off at the MBTA station, be up at the surface, and not have to deal with that through traffic, I think that's just the opposite. Again, think about City Square, and think about all the traffic that's jumping off of 93 and Soldiers Field, Storrow Drive, and coming in from Leverett Circle. All that traffic is able to go underneath City Square. You don't see it, you don't have to deal with it. That's the kind of problem you'd be creating up in Sullivan Square, is if you said, let's let everybody who wants to go through Sullivan Square have to be on the surface. You're creating an environment. Now, think about this. There's going to be 5 or 6 blocks in a given direction. If you walk to one end of those 5 or 6 blocks, you might see the traffic coming up out of one of those underpasses. And if you go this way, you might see somebody entering it or exiting it. But in Sullivan Square, you've got a nice regularized set of intersections, places where people can go shopping, people can sit down, have a coffee on the edge of the sidewalk, and not have to be dealing with the MBTA bus that's coming out of the garage and wants to go back to Hyde Park for its route. Any number of vehicles that are coming over the Alfred Street Bridge and want to go someplace else besides to Sullivan Square. It keeps them out of people's hair.
And the plan right now is to deck over part of that?
Yes, almost all of it. The idea is to create and I'll be happy to show you the plans on this, to create a decking over the reduced size underpass, such that you can potentially have a building on top or open space, civic space.
And who's, would that be state property land then, if the decking is over the highway, or would the city have some control over what happens to that?
The resolution of property lines,
Yeah.
the good news that we have is that all of this is able to be moved around because it's mostly government ownership in this area between the MBTA, the city. I don't know if the state owns anything in this area other than through the MBTA. I think the planning and development might own a small piece of property. BTD owns a piece of property over there. There's a couple of surface parking lots.
So the cost of building the deck over that underpass, would that be absorbed? That would, that stream of funding that you talked about before with the 80% federal, 20% state city, that would include that, or is decking
We hope
separate?
that they will approve that to be part of this, yes.
Okay, but we won't know for a while, or?
No, we have a process to continue through.
Okay. Let's see. So, okay, can we talk about potential climate change and all the flooding that we've been seeing
Sure.
for a little bit, and how you're thinking about that?
Yep.
Especially with the underpass, which would seem to be
Yeah,
much more vulnerable to potential flooding.
yeah. So we have a really good story. I was, I guess, fortunate to be selected to work with the Environment Department when they did the resiliency work and put out the recent study. And one of the reasons why I was invited was because I'm involved in this project. And one of the outcomes of that effort is that there are two ways to protect the underpass and the adjacent areas all the way out to Cambridge and Somerville that can flood through through one property, partially and a little bit through the adjacent Ryan Playground, but the what's the name of that? I'm trying to think of the name of the big company there.
The Schraft building.
Schraft? Schraft, I'm sorry, sure. Just had a mental block there. Yeah, so we've worked with the folks from Schraft's, and we've worked with our design. And there's two-pronged effort. Number one, we're building up the profile of Main Street, going by the Schraft's property. And that is the vulnerable spot. So over by where the fire station is, we'll be taking that street and raising it somewhere between like maybe, it starts out at 0 raising and goes up to about maybe 2 feet in some places. And we've looked at all the adjacent properties, and just by doing that, any water that's coming through Schraft's will stay on the other side of Main Street on the Schraft's property. And so that's built into this project too. Additionally, through the good work of the Environment Department, the folks at Schraft's have been enlightened to things that they might want to do in addition to that along the edge of the river. But we're not going to wait for them to agree to do that. We're going to do what we can do, which is raise the profile of Main Street, and it's consistent with what's recommended in the environment's resiliency study.
Okay. And so the Schraft company will absorb any additional costs that they have on drainage issues that happen because of the city's work, or?
No, the idea is that water rises, and when it reaches a certain point, it can cross over Main Street today. That water's going to be at that height, whatever it's going to get to coming in off the river. Just because we say you can't go past Main Street doesn't mean it still would have been at whatever height on the Schraft's property. We're not creating a flooding situation. They've already got it.
Okay.
We're not going to flood Cambridge Street. I'm sorry, Cambridge and Somerville and Charlestown because they haven't built anything along the edge of the river. They're free to do that whenever they choose.
Okay.
But we're not going to build this project without taking the measures that we can to protect the community from flooding.
All right. And all the costs of dealing with potential high water table and flooding as we're realigning everything and digging the trenches, that's all factored into the construction costs already?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to ask one more and then hand it over to Councilor Presley. Just in terms of public health, so some of the information that community members and advocates have been also raising is the fact that with more traffic and less of a barrier on the underpass option versus the surface option, which would have a wider space for trees and a linear park. So with the smaller, less of a barrier and the cars being in some ways more exposed as they're coming out of the underpass and turning, how are we thinking about potential exposure to particulates for the local residents? Are we measuring anything? Are we making any plans?
The environment we'll be building along the entire length of the corridor is going to be a big improvement from what's out there today. There has been a community objection to the fact, somebody put it on the basis of it's not equitable to give somebody 50 feet of open space next to their property and somebody else only 20. When the 20 didn't exist before, and that's what you can do, balancing all of the other objectives, and you're going to have the entire length of the corridor a two-way bike facility, the entire length of the corridor buffered green space, the entire length of the corridor a pedestrian path. There's a nice off the street, away from moving traffic place to walk. It's a major improvement. And as I quote, you could hear me probably quoted in a public meeting, this is not a park project, this is a transportation project. That's what the money's from. And so if somebody said you're not being equitable and everybody getting a same percentage of park space next to their property, they might have a case if this is what it started out as. But this is one of the extras that we're trying to deliver to the community through a transportation project. The other thing that reminds me too is that we're able to, because of the reconfiguration that we're doing, is add some green space to Ryan Playground. We're not doing all development parcels. We're going to do a stretch of that, and we're going to work with the Parks Department to see how they might want to use that space.
Okay. Okay, sorry, so one more question before I hand it over. So what is the projected lifetime of a redone underpass option?
I guess you'd have to say it's if you do an underpass and you're saying when might you want to rethink that and do something differently?
Or when do you think it will get to the point where it would start deteriorating and we'd need to find more federal funds to...
Well, if it's properly maintained, there's no reason why it can't be around for 80 years.
Okay. Assuming that the sea level rise stays under the 2 feet mark and all that, which some projections I think have it going up 36 inches or more, at least on the harbor side in the next 75 to 100 year time scale. But,
right. That's where some of the work that the Schrafts folks could do would help get a higher level of protection for the long term.
okay. All right, thank you. Councilor Presley?
Thank you so much. And I thank my colleagues for their thorough line of questioning relative to design and impact and mitigation. My apologies for being tardy, so this may have likely already been covered. So I will watch the tape, but I just had a question in terms of timeline and process. So I just was curious as to, I think the deadline for this is June. Are there any community meetings that are scheduled before that timeline? Before that deadline?
Yes, we were just upstairs before this meeting working with our urban design team, and the next meeting is likely to be in March. When we had the last meeting, about 2 weeks ago, I think it was. I was out sick last week, so I might be off a few days, but we said, March or April we'd be back out. Now, to get to the 25% design, you want to go back to, I believe it would be about a year ago, last June, when we re-energized this project. We had a series of 4 meetings over the course of that year, culminating in June with a declaration that we had concluded that we would be building a design with an underpass, 2 underpasses. And since then, we've moved into the phase of trying to say, okay, what are the things that people have on their minds about how the parcels in Sullivan Square should work, how the connectivity of the bike networks would best serve the regional connections that people want to have. Like, for instance, this morning we were talking about the piece that goes up the Mystic River, right before you get to the Alfred Street Bridge. The MBTA is rebuilding the edge of the river, and then DCR is lining up money to continue that. We're going to have an outlet from our bike facilities that go through this entire project that'll connect you right into that. And we're also connecting up to Somerville. We're connecting over to Cambridge. We're creating the points, and we're looking for anybody who has any input that tells us when we miss something of how we take what we're building within this project and making it regionally powerful. We're looking at, how wide should the sidewalks be? Where do people envision civic space taking place in all the parcels we're going to create? And we're going to have plenty of meetings after the 25% submittal. In fact, that's an important point for the public. That's when they get a chance to not talk to us always, but they get a chance to talk directly to Mass DOT. Because what happens with 25% design is, first, there is a series of departmental entities in the state and some in the federal government that'll take a look at these 25% drawings. They'll nudge us this way, that way, and tell us what they like and don't like about it. And in the meanwhile, the community has their chance to testify at the 25% design meeting, which is very important to Mass DOT and Federal Highway. And so there are potential changes that could be made of different nature subsequent to that 25% design hearing. Okay. So we're going to have at least one more meeting, and in that meeting, the content, I think, is going to be about an area. We spent the last meeting primarily up in the Sullivan Square area and also over towards Ryan Playground. And we are going to come back and do what the community needs to show us what they think about different options for how the linear park running up from City Square up to Sullivan Square, how that should be allocated, the space allocation.
Well, I just want to make sure I'm clear. So the deadline is June, and you'll have at least one more meeting, but the purpose of that meeting is simply to talk about outstanding concerns relative to design, specifically around advancing the underpass. You are no longer, my point is, you're no longer considering anything else. We're moving forward, and so what is happening at this meeting?
Yes.
Is
we made a very crystal clear announcement, and it was carried well in the local media back in June, that we had come to the conclusion that we needed to use the version that included underpasses.
Okay.
So
and then you're saying after that, when is the next time you feel that there will be a greater opportunity for community to weigh in? after that 1 year? So you'll do one meeting in March or April before June?
Yeah, potentially
Okay.
a second one if we find that we aren't able to cover everything.
Okay.
Right?
Let me go back to my other questions. Just again, I apologize
Sure.
if these things have already been asked and answered,
Sure.
just in terms of cost. So I want to just make sure I understand all the funding mechanisms here. So you have a large sum of money coming from the city of Boston. You have capital dollars that are coming from when? Is there a contingency plan if one loses their license, their gaming license?
The money that we're currently lined up to use for this project is not WIN's money. It's state and federal dollars totaling $152 million. Now, should WIN's money come into us, we'll have the opportunity to do some enhancements, maybe beyond the current project. And as any of you who have been around government well know, when you're at higher and higher levels of refinement of your plan, your number becomes more and more meaningful, how much it's going to cost.
Can you offer some of those numbers in terms of cost, and also to Councilor Wu's point around maintenance? I'm assuming that's a part of this budget as well, so.
No, this would not be a maintenance budget. This is a capital construction budget.
But, so what is the amount? What will be what is the construction cost? And so
As
I'm
we
saying,
get-
and then beyond that, the maintenance cost.
Yeah, some of those numbers become clearer as you get further into design. In other words, if you start with a concept, which is just a nice graphic of, hey, there's no tunnel, there's a tunnel, that doesn't give you nearly enough information to start getting it. So we passed that concept level, and to have meaningful numbers beyond the ones we have now, the ones we have now are good numbers, but probably subject to refinement as we go along. So we will get clearer and more clarity. So people have to budget at a certain level based on some assumptions based on past projects. And then as this one gets more and more precise, there'll be more and more tied into exactly what we're building.
Do you have a number?
152 million.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Just only because I'd heard conflicting feedback on what the number was, so I just wanted to make sure I was clear. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Council.
Appreciate it.
All right.
And I'm glad you're feeling better.
Thank you.
So I just want to follow up on one question from Councilor Presley's line of questioning, and then I know we have some folks who wish to testify too. So Jim, just going back to your comparison of the surface versus underpass option before you made the decision to abandon the surface option. Mm-hmm. So the evaluation at that point was underpass versus, was it a 5-lane surface option?
The specifics, I'd have to go back and dig out old plans.
Okay, but it was the original 2010 proposed surface option?
I think it was an updated version of that.
With more lanes?
Well, see, as I've mentioned, that there's been an awful lot of growth.
Yeah.
And when we took this thing back out of mothballs, we had our consultant meeting with the property man, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and going through all of what's happening in development, today versus what we were designing to back then.
I guess what I'm curious about was the surface option that you analyzed, the surface alternative versus the underpass to handle this increased amount of traffic. Did you look at a 7-lane, 6-lane option?
We wouldn't want to build a 7-lane road out there, and I don't think anybody who would look you straight in the eye who cares about that community would want 7-lane like on the surface streets going through.
Yeah, so 7, I'm just looking at Professor Firth's recommendation in terms of the plan that he had drawn up. So 7 lanes, which includes left turn lanes on both sides.
That's not my expertise to recall the details of what we looked at various stages.
Okay.
All I can tell you is we had a list of objectives.
Yep.
Of what we were trying to accomplish in this, right? Supporting economic development is one of them, but the ones that we were talking about from day one, things like the pedestrian environment, right? Access to transit, making the development parcels, developable in Sullivan Square. And there's a couple of others that don't pass my mind right now, but
Okay, well, I would love to speak more offline
Sure.
about how some of these line up with the report that we've been given. I think you must know Professor Firth had helped advise the council on our transportation policy briefing series over the last year, so we know him well, and he knows his stuff. And I think, as Councilor Presley pointed out, it seems like we're approaching a really critical juncture for locking in all the details before the next public meeting, et cetera. So.
well, if I could react to we're not coming near a pressure point on time. We're into it.
Yeah.
You know, we've gone in since last June and been working straight through on our design. We would lose like 8 or 9 months if we were to change the concept today. You know, we'd be blowing the schedule.
Yeah, I
If
mean,
we-
I hear that. I just want to make sure
Yeah.
the public has a chance to hear your feedback and your reaction to a potential alternative that I don't know, it sounds like may or may not have been discussed earlier, and, being mindful of wanting to make sure the city keeps its place in the queue relative to other projects that want to be funded. We also are asking for a little consideration in the scheme of planning for a project that will likely last, as you say, for potentially forever if it's maintained properly, right? Okay, so any other questions for Councilor Flynn or, good, Councilor Presley, do you have any other?
Oh, no, thank you,
Okay,
Madam Chairman.
so thank you so much, Jim.
You're welcome.
And we will move to public testimony. I have 2 folks signed up, Ivy St. John, and Emma Ishar. So if you both could, sorry? Amy's not here, okay, got it. So you both could feel free to come speak at these sort of cutout podiums right on the side. This is our new setup, Ivy, is this, I'll show you.
Oh, I'm supposed to be back here? Oh, the big guys sit in front and the little guys sit in back.
Yep, that's the goal, is for universal accessibility.
You're way over there.
Okay, Ivy, please.
Michelle, thank you very much. Councilor Flynn and Ayanna, thank you. I think your questions have been very, very well put, and we're very grateful for your curiosity. You have the letter. I'm just going to read the letter, and then Emma will speak. Dear Chairperson Wu and the members of the Planning and Development Transportation Committee, we understand that the committee will be considering authorizing acceptance of $250,000 in grant funds from the Massachusetts Gaming Commission to fund a portion of the design costs for Rutherford Avenue and Sullivan Square Project. We urge the committee to delay acceptance of the funds until a number of key questions are answered and community concerns are addressed. The Rutherford Corridor Improvement Coalition has been in existence in Charlestown, working on this project since 2010. I would add here that for many of us who have lived in Charlestown a long time, the planning on this corridor has gone back to the middle 90s too. We had a whole process in the middle 90s that unfortunately did not get implemented, so we're back to square one. Our goal throughout this process has been to work with the city to craft a plan that maximizes benefits for the neighborhood, City of Boston, the region, and minimizes cost, including dollars and negative impacts. We understand that the Boston Transportation Department is indicating there is some level of urgency about the project now. But the truth is that there is only one opportunity to get this project right, and with an anticipated public investment of well over $160 million. The $160 million was quoted by Mr. Galuli at the public meeting on January 24th. We strongly believe that all avenues must be explored to ensure a design that offers the best outcomes and is the one that is ultimately built. As you are aware, in 2013, the city decided to proceed with a surface design that removed the existing underpasses at Austin Street and Sullivan Square and rebuilt the roadway from North Washington Street Bridge to the Alfred Street Bridge leading to Everett. This was reopened by BTD late in 2016 to analyze the potential traffic impacts from the Wynn Casino. In November 2017, after essentially no community process, BTD announced the city had changed its position and selected a design that rebuilt the two underpasses as the preferred concept despite significant opposition. We have communicated with city officials, the Lower Mystic Regional Planning Group, and the Boston MPO on multiple occasions. Please find background materials and correspondence attached to this letter. Among the questions and concerns that remain unaddressed are the following. In the most recent process, BTD did not sincerely explore the surface option. In fact, although the department has insisted that a surface design is not possible, Professor Peter Firth of Northeastern University has proven that not only is the surface design possible at Austin Street, but that vehicular movements would be better served than in the city's preferred underpass design. He also found multiple aspects of the underpass design to be unsafe for pedestrians and in violation of Mass DOT. Please see attachment B. From the neighborhood perspective, the difference between the two is dramatic. 21 feet of open space. I don't want it to be just open space. We're talking about a neighborhood buffer here for residents on Washington Street, Essex Street, Baldwin Street, and on Rutherford Avenue. From a neighborhood perspective, the difference between the two is dramatic. 21 feet of open space on the neighborhood side with the underpass design at Austin Street, only 10 feet more than there is today, as compared to 49 plus feet with the surface design. It is important to note that Professor First used exactly the same traffic count and traffic growth assumptions in his analysis that BTD had used. His findings on Austin Street call into question BT's analysis at Sullivan Square as well. BTD has never shown the community its estimates for cost of design and construction of the underpass design and has not compared it to the cost of the surface design. The same is true for ongoing maintenance costs of both options. We are not aware of any Boston transportation design process that did not make cost information available to the public during the community process in the past. And we are very concerned that the construction cost differential may be in the tens of millions of dollars. Ongoing maintenance costs are likely to be higher with an underpass than without. The existence of an underpass at Sullivan Square negatively affects the development potential of the area. Not only does this reduce the potential for local jobs and housing, it affects the city's revenues that would be generated through future property taxes. Last month, the Charlestown neighborhood experienced flooding along the waterfront and in the Navy Yard and at Baldwin Street. The entire project area is built on fill and is subject to increased flooding due to sea level rise. Constructing underpasses in such a location is not consistent with the city's goals for climate resiliency and could put drivers and public safety personnel at risk in the future. BTD never publicly compared the two alternatives as they relate to the stated goals. Those goals include improving pedestrian connections, safety to the T stations, creating public open space, providing opportunities for appropriate development, among others. If such a comparison were released, we believe the surface design would be better in all those goals. We appreciate very much the opportunity to appear before the committee at a future date and offer more extensive testimony regarding this project and the technical analysis performed by Northeastern University. We respectfully request that you delay the authorization of additional funding until such a time. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Ivy.
I want to say that I represent 400 people who have signed the petition. You have a copy of the petition.
Great. Thank you.
Anything else? No questions?
No questions from me.
I would like to point out that the Schrafft's building is not the company that owns. It's the Flatley Company.
Oh, I see.
And they own from the Schrafft's building all the way down to the Lafarge property. It's a very large piece of property. And the city's raising of the intersection of Main Street, Medford Street, and Bunker Hill Street does trap any flooding on the Flatley property. It does not allow it to drain effectively.
Got it.
That's
Thank
it.
you.
Emma?
Emma?
Is this on? Yeah. Emma Yashar, I live at 41 Union Street in Charlestown. For those of you not familiar, that is right near the Austin Street intersection that Peter Firth developed that design for. Thank you all for your time and for your questions. It showed to me that you are paying attention and that you're listening to the concerns the community has raised. I think I have just a couple of things to say sort of personally for me in addition to what the letter that Ivy read. As a citizen, I think one of the most disheartening things you can experience is when you feel like decisions that affect your home and your neighborhood and your quality of life are being made, you know, in back rooms with a political agenda attached to them and without kind of appropriate data and technical analysis, and maybe in some senses in spite of what that data and technical analysis says. And, you know, case in point, overturning a decision that was the result of a, you know, lengthy and authentic community process back in 2010 through 2013, through, you know, a process that I don't think anyone in the community has said is authentic or meaningful. And then right afterwards, here comes Peter Firth, and he demonstrates essentially that not only is he able to better satisfy the community's goals with the design at the Austin Street intersection, but he's actually better able to solve the city's goals as well with respect to vehicular capacity and the metrics that the city is using. And the last thing I would ever do, I mean, Rutherford Ave, certainly Ivy has noted, this has been an issue for a very long time. I think it's important to think of the entire stretch, not just Sullivan Square. I noticed some of the questions that were being asked. You asked a question, you got an answer just about Sullivan Square. I definitely think this merits looking at Sullivan Square and Austin Street separately from one another. Indeed, because the plan that's been proposed affects those of us along that route very differently. But so this has been going on for a very long time, independent of the casino, independent of the other development that we're seeing in the area like North Point and Assembly Row, much of which has been kind of on the books for a very long time. The last thing I would want is for the city to not accept funds from the Gaming Commission because this is an area that needs to be studied and needs further design work. But I would appreciate this council and this committee asking tough questions about, you know, what exactly might throw us off of that timeline. I question that spending a little additional time, particularly to review the design that Professor Firth has suggested, I question that that really threatens funding from the MPO that's been on the books for a while. I imagine this kind of thing happens with transportation projects all the time. They're constantly in flux, and that the MPO would understand that. So, you know, I think I certainly would appreciate some sort of hearing or, you know, opportunity for the public to comment, some sort of, you know, true analysis of what Professor Firth has put forward, because it is, to me, a viable option that, albeit with more traffic lanes, because, excuse me, because the underpasses are such an inefficient use of space, with those more traffic lanes to carry more vehicular capacity, we actually get a better intersection for the people that live in the area. And so I guess that would be my request, is that this council give the community an opportunity to have a hearing on that proposal where we can give it the consideration that it's due. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. So with no further comment from my colleagues, this hearing on docket 0139 has been adjourned.